The world of the Pearl River Delta does not begin with the open ocean, but with the silt. In the year 1801, the delta is a sprawling liquid labyrinth where the great rivers of southern China dissolve into 1,000 muddy veins before finally surrendering to the South China Sea. Here, the water is a thick, opaque green, carrying the runoff of the mountains and the secrets of the inland provinces. The air is so heavy with humidity that it feels like a damp cloth pressed against the skin, smelling of salt, decaying river grass, and the omnipresent scent of wood smoke from 10,000 cooking fires. This is not the clean blue of the Caribbean. This is a landscape of mist, shadows, and the constant rhythmic slapping of tea-colored waves against the hulls of 1,000,000 wooden vessels. You are standing on the deck of a flower boat, a floating brothel adorned with intricate red silk lanterns and carved dragon motifs, moored in the bustling harbor of Canton. The soundscape here is a chaotic symphony of human survival. You hear the high-pitched calls of fruit sellers in small sampans, the rhythmic thud-thud of mallets in the shipyards, and the distant, haunting melody of a bamboo flute drifting across the water. But beneath the music and the trade, there is an undercurrent of danger. The Qing dynasty is aging, its grip on the coast slipping like sand through a fist. Out in the hazy horizon, where the river meets the sea, the pirates are waiting. Among the thousands of women working the flower boats is Xiang. She is sharp-witted, observant, and possesses a mind that can calculate the value of a cargo ship faster than any merchant. Her life is about to change forever. Zheng Yi, the most powerful pirate chieftain of the era, does not come to the flower boats for simple pleasure. He comes for a partner. He sees in Xiang not just beauty, but a strategic genius that matches his own. When he captures her, or perhaps when she allows herself to be taken, it is not an act of submission, it is a merger. The ritual of their union is not one of silk robes and courtly tradition. It is signed in the salt spray and the smell of gunpowder. She agrees to join him on one condition, that she holds 50% of the power. She is no longer just a woman of the boats. She is the co-commander of the Red Flag Fleet. This is the birth of the woman the world will come to fear as Zheng Yi Sao, the wife of Zheng. As you transition from the river to the open sea, the vessels change. You are no longer on a fragile flower boat, but on a massive Cantonese junk-A, backbone of the Red Flag Fleet. These ships are engineering marvels, far sturdier and more maneuverable than the square-rigged ships of the Western powers. The hull is divided into watertight compartments, a technology unknown to Europe at the time, ensuring that even if a cannonball pierces the side, the ship will not sink. The sails are the most striking feature. Made of heavy bamboo matting and reinforced with vertical slats, they look like the wings of an ancient bat. When the wind catches them, they don't flap like canvas. They creak with a deep, organic resonance. The sound of 100 junks moving together is like the breathing of a forest. The decks are cluttered with bronze cannons, coils of hemp rope, and the personal belongings of the crew. Unlike Western pirates, these men live on their ships with their families. The deck is a village, smelling of dried fish, fermented soy, and the pungent aroma of baijiu, the strong grain spirit the pirates drink to steel their nerves. As the fleet moves through the Ladrone Islands, the pirate-infested archipelagos of the south, the sensory details become more intimate. You hear the constant shush of the bow cutting through the silt-heavy water. You hear the clatter of dice in a bamboo cup as the sailors gamble away their share of the last raid. The language of the fleet is a thick Cantonese dialect, a tonal dance of sharp consonants and long singing vowels. Zheng Yi Sao moves through this world with a quiet, terrifying authority. She doesn't need to shout to be heard. She understands the most important rule of the sea. Loyalty is not bought with gold, but with order. The pirate world before her was a collection of brawling gangs. She is turning it into a corporate entity. She begins to draft the first of her legendary codes. These are not suggestions. They are the law of the Red Flag. Rule 1. Any man giving his own orders or disobeying those of a superior shall be beheaded. Rule 2. Theft from the common treasury or from the villagers who provide the fleet with supplies is a capital offense. The silence that follows the reading of these rules is more profound than any shout. It is the silence of 80,000 outlaws realizing that their world has changed. They are no longer just pirates. They are a nation afloat. As the sun sets over the South China Sea, the sky turns a bruised purple and orange. The heat of the day recedes, replaced by a cool, salty breeze that carries the scent of the deep ocean, ozonic, cold, and infinite. You sit on the high stern of the flagship, watching the other flags of the Confederation rise across the horizon. There is the black flag, the white flag, the blue, the yellow, and the green. But in the center, dominant and glowing in the twilight, is the red flag. The evening meal on the junk is a communal affair. A large iron wok is placed over a charcoal brazier, sizzling with whatever the sea provided that day: squid, pomfret, or perhaps a sea turtle. The steam rises into the rigging, mixing with the smell of the sea. There is no hierarchy in the food. The commander eats what the cabin boy eats. This equality is the glue that holds the 80,000 together. Zheng Yi Sao sits at the head of the table, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She is not looking for a prize to plunder. She is looking at the map of the Pearl River Delta as if it were a game of Go. She sees the weaknesses in the Qing Navy, the arrogance of the British East India Company, and the untapped wealth of the Portuguese traders in Macau. She is the architect of a new world. As the fleet anchors in a hidden cove, the sleep factor of the South China Sea takes over. The water in these coves is still as glass, reflecting the stars so clearly that it feels as though the ship is floating in the center of the galaxy. You hear the rhythmic thump-thump of the night watchman's wooden clappers, ensuring that the crew stays alert. You hear the soft, rhythmic snoring of hundreds of families tucked away in the lower decks. The ship itself is never truly silent. It groans as the tide shifts, the wood expanding and contracting with the temperature. The bamboo sails, even when lowered, rustle in the light breeze like dry parchment. It is a comforting, ancient sound. You are protected by the wooden walls of the junk and the 80,000 blades of the Red Flag Fleet. Zheng Yi Sao remains awake in her cabin, lit by a single candle made of tallow. She is reviewing the ledgers. Every bag of rice, every ounce of silver, and every bolt of silk is accounted for. She knows that to command the sea, one must first command the math. This is her secret power. While the Western pirates drink themselves into a stupor, she is building a bureaucracy that will eventually challenge an empire. As you drift toward sleep, the image of the red flag remains in your mind, a vibrant, defiant splash of color against the endless gray and green of the Delta. You are part of the greatest outlaw organization the world has ever known, led by a woman who rose from the flower boats to become the sovereign of the South China Sea. The journey has only just begun. The wind is shifting to the north, The tide is coming in, and the red flag is ready to fly. The section ends with the rhythmic creaking of the junk and the distant, lonely cry of a seabird, as the fleet waits for the first light of a new, imperial dawn. The transition from a loose collection of sea raiders to a unified naval empire was not achieved through the edge of a blade alone, but through the terrifying power of the written word. You must imagine the scene on the deck of the flagship, a vessel so large it felt like a floating island, where Zheng Yi Sao sat surrounded by the 5 other great pirate chieftains. The air was thick with the smell of salt and the heavy, sweet scent of tobacco smoke. Before her lay the scrolls of the new code. For a listener to understand her success, they must understand that she did not just command pirates. She governed a floating nation. She knew that 80,000 outlaws, if left to their own impulses, would devour each other. To prevent this, she turned the Red Flag fleet into the most disciplined military force in the South China Sea. The first tenet of her code was absolute. Any man who gives his own orders, or disobeyed those of a superior, shall be beheaded on the spot. This was the foundation of the silence that followed her presence. In the Caribbean, pirate ships were often democratic to the point of chaos, with captains voted in and out at the whim of the crew. In the Red Flag fleet, the hierarchy was celestial. Disobedience was not an act of rebellion, it was a death sentence. As the narrator's voice drops to a whisper, one can almost hear the rhythmic sharpening of a heavy cleaver against a whetstone, a sound that acted as a constant reminder of the price of ego. This discipline allowed her to move thousands of ships as if they were a single limb, a feat of logistics that the Imperial Qing Navy could only dream of. But her code went deeper into the fabric of human morality than mere military obedience. She established a rule that was revolutionary for its time and place. No man shall steal from the common treasury, or from the villagers who supply the fleet. This was a masterstroke of social engineering. By protecting the coastal farmers and fishermen, she ensured that the Red Flag fleet would never go hungry. The villagers began to see the pirates not as predators, but as customers and protectors. They would sell their best rice and their freshest pigs to the Red Flag, while providing the Imperial Navy with nothing but rotten grain and misinformation. The sensory world of the fleet was thus one of abundance. While the government soldiers starved, the pirates feasted on steamed ginger, fish braised pork, and bowls of hot white rice, all prepared in the massive woks that hissed over the charcoal fires in the ship's galleys. The most famous part of her code concerned the treatment of female captives. In the rough world of 19th-century seafaring, women were usually seen as spoils of war. Zheng Yi Sao, remembering her own origins on the flower boats, forbade this. Her law stated that if a pirate took a beautiful captive as his wife, he must remain faithful to her. If he mistreated her, or if he forced himself upon a woman without the intent of marriage, the punishment was death. This transformed the fleet into a family-oriented society. On these massive junks, women were not just passengers, they were the logistical heart of the fleet. They managed the accounts, repaired the sails, and raised the children. Imagine a pirate ship where the sound of cannon fire is punctuated by the domestic sounds of a mother humming a Cantonese lullaby, or the clatter of bowls being washed in the salt water. This domesticity provided the men with a reason to fight that went beyond simple greed. They were defending their homes, which just happened to be made of wood and bamboo and floating on the tide. As the fleet moves deeper into the delta, the environment becomes an ally. The South China Sea is a world of ghost water, where the heavy sea mists can descend in minutes, swallowing 1,000-masted fleet as if it never existed. You are on the deck during a morning fog. The world has shrunk to the width of the ship's railing. The bamboo sails are heavy with moisture, dripping steadily onto the deck. Drip, 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 a rhythmic hypnotic sound that masks the movement of the water. In this fog, the pirates move with a supernatural confidence. They know every sandbar, every hidden inlet, and every rhythmic shift of the tide. They use sound signals, the low, resonant boom of a bronze gong, or the sharp, staccato blast of a conch shell to communicate across the mist. To an outsider, these sounds are terrifying, the voices of sea spirits calling from the void. To the pirate, they are the coordinates of a perfectly orchestrated dance. The organization was further solidified by the color-coded flag system. The red flag was the center, but the black, white, blue, yellow, and green fleets each had their own territories and responsibilities. This was a franchise of terror. Each fleet was required to contribute a percentage of their loot to a central fund, which Zheng Yi Sao managed with the cold precision of a central banker. This fund was used to buy ammunition from Portuguese smugglers in Macau and to pay the massive network of spies she maintained in every port from Canton to Vietnam. The scent of the fleet's power was the smell of high-grade black powder, sulphurous and biting, and the earthy, metallic smell of silver coins being counted in the dead of night. She was the first person to realize that the sea could be managed like an office, and the sword was merely a tool to ensure the ledgers stayed balanced. The sheer scale of the fleet meant that they rarely had to engage in the kind of swashbuckling combat seen in Western fiction. Instead, they practiced the art of the blockade. Imagine a coastal town waking up to find the horizon completely obscured by the bat-wing sails of 1,000 junks. The sound is not the roar of cannons, but the silence of an overwhelming presence. The town officials would inevitably row out to the flagship bearing gifts of silk, silver, and gold to buy protection. This was the true source of her wealth. She was taxing the sea, and the Qing emperor was powerless to stop her. The protection money was recorded in meticulously kept books, a bureaucracy of piracy that mirrored the very government it was defying. The sound of the brush scratching against rice paper she was as vital to her empire as the sound of the wind in the rigging. Life on the junk was a constant cycle of maintenance and preparation. When the wind died down, the men would spend hours paying the seams of the ship with chunama mixture of lime and wood oil that created a waterproof seal. The smell was sharp and acidic, a scent that became synonymous with the pirate life. Others would be repairing the bamboo slats of the sails, their fingers moving with the speed of weavers. The sails were the lungs of the fleet, and any tear was a threat to the collective survival. You hear the rhythmic snip-snip of shears and the pulling of heavy hemp thread through the matting. This was a world of tactile reality, the rough texture of the bamboo, the oily slick of the lime, and the cold, salt-crusted wood of the deck. As the sun sets, the fleet anchors in a formation that resembles a floating fortress. The ships are lashed together with thick cables, creating a platform that spans miles of water. This allowed for the movement of people and supplies between vessels without the need for small boats. On this massive wooden plain, the pirates lived their lives. You might see a theatrical troupe performing an opera on the deck of a transport ship, their high-pitched singing echoing across the calm water. You might see a school for the children of the crew, where the lessons were punctuated by the sight of the open sea. Zheng Yi Sao understood that to keep 80,000 people happy, she had to provide them with a culture, not just a career. This was the floating world in its most literal and stable form. The nights were governed by the 5 watches. Each watch was marked by a different rhythm on the drums. The first watch was for reflection, the second for rest, the third for vigilance, the fourth for preparation, and the fifth for the greeting of the sun. As you lie in your hammock in the hold of the ship, the sounds of the ocean are muffled by the thick cedar planks. You hear the water rushing past the hull, a deep, bubbling sound, like a cauldron on a low fire. You hear the creak of the rudder, the heavy heartbeat of the ship. Above you, the feet of the sentries move with a soft, rhythmic thud. There is a sense of immense safety in this. You are not a lone outlaw. You are a cell in a massive, invincible organism. The red flag is your sky, and Zheng Yi Sao is your North Star. Her presence was felt even when she was not seen. She lived in the grand cabin of the flagship, a room filled with maps, astronomical charts, and a collection of clocks from Europe. She was fascinated by the way the Westerners measured time, yet she knew their time in Asia was limited. The scent in her cabin was a mixture of old parchment, expensive tea, and the faint ozone smell of the sea air coming through the open windows. She was a woman who lived in the future, always calculating the next move of the British frigates or the next seasonal shift of the monsoons. She knew that the wind was her greatest ally and her most temperamental servant. As the second section of her story draws to a close, the fleet is preparing for its first major confrontation with a combined force of the provincial navy and the Red Barbarians, the European traders. The tension in the air is palpable, a static charge that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The pirates are not afraid, they are ready. They have the code, they have the fleet, and they have the sovereign. The sound of the ocean is rising. The tide is pulling the ships toward the mouth of the river, and the batwing sails are beginning to unfurl one by one, like the wings of a waking dragon. The red flag is snapping in the wind, a vibrant, bloody promise of the storm to come. The world of the Pearl River Delta is about to witness the true power of the red flag sovereign. The silence of the fog is over. The time for the ledger is done. Now the air will be filled with the thunder of the long guns and the cries of those who dared to believe they could own the South China Sea. You drift into a deeper sleep, the rhythmic creaking of the ship's timbers acting as a lullaby, knowing that you are under the protection of the greatest pirate queen who ever lived. The water is deep, the moon is hidden, and the red flag is moving. The mobilization of 80,000 people is not a sudden explosion, but a slow, grinding shift of an entire ecosystem. As the word of the impending battle spreads through the 6 fleets, the domestic sounds of the junks begin to sharpen into the sounds of war. The iron walks are cleaned and stowed. The children are moved to the innermost holds of the sturdiest vessels. The heavy bronze cannons are uncapped and wiped of their protective grease. You must imagine the sound of the great cleaning, the rhythmic scrubbing of the decks with sand and seawater, until the wood is white and grippy, ensuring that no man will slip in the heat of combat. This is a tactile world of preparation. The pirates are winding wet hemp rope around the barrels of the cannons to prevent them from bursting under the heat of repeated firing. The smell of wet rope and cold metal fills the air, a scent that signals the end of the peace. Zheng Yi Sao herself moves among the fleet in a fast, narrow scout boat. She is checking the lines of communication. To her, the fleet is a series of nodes in a network, and she must ensure that every link is strong. As her boat pulls alongside a Black Flag junk, she doesn't offer a speech of glory or riches. She simply points to the horizon and reminds the captain of the code. The threat of her law is more motivating than the promise of gold. The pirates look at her with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. They see in her the personification of the sea itself, calm one moment, destructive the next, and always, always governed by its own internal logic. The European ships, the British and the Portuguese, are a different kind of threat. Their men of war are like floating cathedrals of canvas and oak, carrying more cannons on a single deck than an entire pirate squadron. But they are deep-holed and clumsy in the shallow, silt-heavy waters of the delta. Zheng Yi Sao knows this. She is planning to turn the very geography of China into a weapon. She studies the Lantau Passage, a narrow strait where the currents are treacherous and the wind is unpredictable. She is not going to fight them on the open ocean. She is going to lure them into the dragon's throat. The sound of her planning is the soft, rhythmic tapping of a wooden pointer against a silk map, a sound that carries the weight of thousands of lives. The sensory details of the night before the battle are hauntingly beautiful. The pirates engage in a ritual of light and shadow. Thousands of small, floating lanterns are released into the water not for the dead, but to gauge the speed and direction of the current. The water is covered in these flickering stars, bobbing and weaving in the dark. The only sound is the soft lapping of the waves and the occasional, distant cry of a heron. It is a moment of profound stillness before the world erupts. You can smell the incense being burned at the small altars on the decks, a thick, sweet smoke intended to appease the goddess of the sea, Mazu. The pirates are asking for her favor, but they are relying on Zheng Yi Sao's brain. As the morning light begins to bleed through the eastern clouds, the fleet begins its final approach. The junks move in crescent formations, a tactic borrowed from the ancient steppe warriors, but adapted for the sea. The sails are not fully unfurled, but kept at half-wing, allowing for sudden bursts of speed or quick turns. The sound is the collective groan of 1,000 rudders turning at once. The water of the Lantau Passage is a churning brown, the silt kicked up by the movement of so many hulls. The pirates are silent now, their hands on the long-handled pudao blades and the jingles massive, heavy muskets that require 2 men to fire. The first sight of the European ships is their masts, rising over the horizon like the bare branches of a winter forest. They look majestic, but fragile. As the two forces close the distance, the atmosphere changes. The sleep factor of the story now shifts into a rhythmic, hypnotic tension. The sound of the wind through the rigging of the British ships is a high-pitched musical whistle, while the sound of the wind through the bamboo sails of the Red Flag is a deep, percussive thrum. It is a battle of sounds, a battle of elements. Zheng Yi Sao stands on the high stern of her flagship, her red cloak snapping in the wind, a single point of fire in a world of gray and green. The battle begins not with a roar, but with a signal. A single, brilliant white flare is fired from the flagship, arching over the water like a falling star. Immediately, the fireship's old kerosene-soaked hulks are released into the current, drifting toward the European line. The sound of the fire is a terrifying, rhythmic crackle-whoosh, the heat so intense it can be felt across the water. The smell is an oily, thick smoke that blinds the enemy. This is the chaos the red flag thrives in. In the smoke and the fire, the small, maneuverable junks swarm the larger ships like hornets around a bear. You hear the first broadside from a British 74-gun ship. It is a sound that shatters the air, a deep, earth-shaking boom that vibrates through your very bones. But the junks are too low, too fast. The cannonballs skip across the water, kicking up massive plumes of spray, but missing their marks. The pirates respond with their jingles, the heavy lead balls whistling through the air with a sound like tearing silk. The battle is a sensory nightmare of smoke, thunder, and the metallic taste of fear. But at the center of it all is the calm, calculating heart of Zheng Yi Sao. She is watching the currents, watching the smoke, and waiting for the moment to close the trap. As the morning progresses, the superior numbers and the local knowledge of the red flag begin to tell. The European ships, terrified of running aground in the treacherous shallows, begin to pull back. But the crescent has already closed around them. The sound of the battle is now the sound of wood grinding against wood, the terrifying, splintering crash of a junk boarding a frigate. The pirates use bamboo ladders and grappling hooks, their movements practiced and silent. They don't shout, they work with a lethal, professional efficiency. This is the ultimate expression of the code, a machine made of 80,000 parts, working in perfect unison to defeat an empire. By noon, the Battle of the Lantau Passage is over. The European ships that could flee have vanished into the mist. Those that could not are being stripped of their cargo and their dignity. The red flag has held the sea. The soundscape returns to the rhythmic slap-slap of the waves and the tired, triumphant murmurs of the crew. The smell of gunpowder lingers, but it is being washed away by the fresh sea breeze. Zheng Yi Sao returns to her cabin, her red cloak dusted with ash. She doesn't celebrate. She opens her ledgers. There are losses to record, supplies to replenish, and the next tax to collect. As you drift back into a peaceful sleep, the image of the fleet remains not as a collection of criminals, but as a masterpiece of human organization. The South China Sea is quiet once more, the batwing sails silhouetted against the setting sun. You are safe in the heart of the red flag, protected by the laws of the sovereign and the ancient rhythms of the tide. The water is your home, the wind is your breath, and the sovereign is your shield. The victory at Lantau Passage was more than a military triumph. It was a baptism of the red flag's sovereignty. In the months that followed, the South China Sea transformed into a private lake governed by a woman who had never stepped foot in a palace, yet understood the mechanics of power better than the mandarins in Beijing. You must imagine the golden age of the fleet not as a period of constant raiding, but as a period of terrifying, efficient stability. The air of the Pearl River Delta began to carry a new vibration, rhythmic, humming pulse of a shadow empire that operated in broad daylight. Zheng Yi Sao had realized that to truly own the water, she had to own the land that fed it. She began to weave a web of intelligence and logistics that turned every coastal village, every salt shack, and every market stall into an extension of her eyes and ears. The sensory experience of this shadow government was subtle yet absolute. If you were a merchant in Canton or a Portuguese trader in Macau, you no longer feared the sudden appearance of a pirate junk. Instead, you waited for the passport collector. This was a man, often dressed in the respectable silk of a mid-level clerk, who would approach your counting house with a ledger and a brush. He didn't come with a sword, but with a receipt. The sound of the pirate bureaucracy was the dry, rhythmic scritch-scratch of a brush against mulberry paper. Once you paid your protection tax, you were given a small, triangular yellow flag to fly from your mast. To see the harbor of Canton during this time was to see a sea of yellow, thousands of legitimate merchant ships flying the pirate's pass, signaling that they were under the protection of the red flag. The soundscape of the harbor shifted from the tension of potential attack to the industrious hum of a sanctioned monopoly. You hear the rhythmic clack-clack of the Abacus beads in the pirate-controlled warehouses, where the loot of the world cloves from the Moluccas, sandalwood from Timor, and English broadcloth was inventoried and resold back into the Chinese market. Zheng Yi Sao had turned piracy into a supply chain. The smell of the docks was no longer just salt and rot. It was the rich, intoxicating scent of global trade, the spicy bite of black pepper, the earthy sweetness of unrefined sugar, and the metallic temps of copper ingots. She had become the middleman for an entire continent, and her cut was taken from every transaction. Behind the scenes, the information network of the fleet was a masterpiece of human psychology. Zheng Yi Sao knew that the greatest weapon was not the cannon, but the secret. She employed thousands of shorefolk, market women, tea-house servers, and dock workers who acted as her spies. Imagine the quiet, domestic scene in a Canton tea-house, the rhythmic bubbling of the water in a cast-iron kettle, the soft clatter of porcelain cups, and the low-frequency murmur of government officials discussing the next naval patrol. Among them, a woman pouring tea listens to every word, memorizing the names of the captains and the weight of the silver on the ships. By nightfall, that information is carried by a fast rowing sampan out to the red flag, moving through the reeds of the riverbank with a soft, rhythmic hiss-hush. The organization of the fleet itself reached a level of complexity that mirrored the imperial court. Zheng Yi Sao established offices of provisioning on the remote Ladrone Islands. These were not mere hideouts, but fully functioning towns built on the rugged cliffs overlooking the sea. You hear the sound of the pirate's life on land, the rhythmic thud-thud of a blacksmith's hammer shaping iron for new anchors, the singing of women as they weave massive bamboo sails, and the laughter of children playing in the tide pools. The smell of these islands was a mixture of drying fish and the sharp, clean scent of the mountain air. These were the sanctuaries of the red flag, where the pirates could rest, repair their ships, and spend their silver in markets that were far better stocked than the government-controlled cities. The Great Blockade was the ultimate expression of this power. In 1808, the Qing emperor, frustrated by his inability to collect maritime taxes, ordered a massive extermination campaign. But Zheng Yi Sao didn't retreat. She ordered the red flag, the black flag, and the white flag to move as one, effectively sealing off the entrance to the Pearl River. Imagine the sight from the walls of Canton. The horizon is a solid wall of dark wood and red bamboo. The sound is the collective, low-pitched groan of 500 junks riding the tide in perfect formation. Not a single bag of rice or a single crate of tea could enter or leave the city without her permission. The economic heart of China had been stopped by a woman from the flower boats. The sensory details of the blockade were a study in psychological warfare. The pirates didn't fire a single shot for weeks. Instead, they played music. You hear the high-pitched wailing melody of the surna, a traditional oboe, and the deep, rhythmic boom of the great war drums, the tangu echoing across the water toward the starving city. It was a sound of absolute confidence, a sound that said, "The sea belongs to us, and we are in no hurry." The wind carried the scent of the pirates, cooking fires, the delicious aroma of roasted duck and fermented black beans into the nostrils of the hungry government soldiers on the shore. This was a war of the senses, a war of patience. Inside the flagship, the grand ledger grew thicker every day. Zheng Yi Sao's cabin was a quiet sanctuary of order in a world of water. You hear the rhythmic ticking of her European clocks, a sound of precision that contrasted with the chaotic shifting of the tides outside. She was managing the most complex payroll in the world. Every pirate, from the highest captain to the lowest powder monkey, was paid a regular wage from the central treasury. She had even established a pension fund for the widows and orphans of the fleet. This social safety net was unheard of in the 19th century, and it ensured a level of loyalty that no amount of gold could buy. The sound of the pirate life was now the sound of security, the soft, rhythmic clinking of silver coins being distributed every month. But the Golden Age also brought internal challenges. The 6 pirate chieftains were men of ego and violence, and it took all of Zheng Yi Sao's strategic brilliance to keep them from turning on each other. She used the language of the table to maintain order. She hosted massive banquets on the deck of her flagship, where the seating was arranged with the precision of a diplomatic summit. The sound of these banquets was the rhythmic clinking of wine cups and the loud, boisterous laughter of men who lived every day as if it were their last. But beneath the laughter was a sharp, cold edge of negotiation. She was the great arbitrator, settling disputes over territory and loot with a mind that was as cold and clear as the deep ocean. The sensory immersion of the nighttime fleet during the blockade was particularly hypnotic. With the ships lashed together for stability, the pirates created a floating city that stretched for miles. You could walk from ship to ship on planks laid across the railings. You hear the rhythmic tap-tap of a blind storyteller's cane as he moves from junk to junk, reciting the ancient tales of the 3 kingdoms to a rapt audience of outlaws. You hear the soft, rhythmic splashing of the night guard's oars as they patrol the perimeter. The water reflects the thousands of lanterns, turning the delta into a world of flickering light and deep, velvety shadows. It is a world of immense, quiet power, protected by the code of the red flag and the sheer weight of 80,000 souls. The Golden Age was also a time of technological innovation. Zheng Yi Sao encouraged her blacksmiths to study the captured European cannons, leading to the creation of hybrid guns that combined Western power with Chinese reliability. You hear the sound of these new weapons being tested on remote beaches, a sound like a crack of thunder that echoes through the limestone caves. The smell is the biting, sulfurous smoke of the highest grade black powder. She was building a navy that was not just larger than the emperor's, but more advanced. She was preparing for the day when the black wind of the Qing dynasty would try one last time to reclaim the sea. As the 3rd section of her story draws to a close, the Red Flag sovereign is at the absolute peak of her influence. She has tamed the pirates, outsmarted the merchants, and humiliated the emperor. The South China Sea is a clockwork machine of her own design, and the world is forced to watch in silence. The sound of the ocean is a steady, rhythmic breathing, a sound of peace that belies the violence beneath the surface. You drift into a deeper sleep, the image of the red-winged junks silhouetted against a golden moon, knowing that the sovereign is watching over the water, her ledgers full, her cannons ready, and her empire secure. To maintain such a massive population on the water required a logistical miracle every single day. You must imagine the water train, a secondary fleet of thousands of small, fast sampans that acted as the bloodstream of the Red Flag. These boats didn't carry weapons. They carried the lifeblood of the empire, fresh water, vegetables, and medicine. The sound of the water train was the rhythmic, high-pitched creak of the ulo, the large rear sculling, or used to propel the boats through the narrowest channels. These oarsmen worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, ensuring that the 80,000 never went thirsty. The smell of the water train was a fresh, green scent, smell of mountain springs and garden-fresh bok choy that cut through the salty, metallic air of the main fleet. This was the true secret of Zheng Yi Sao's longevity. While other pirate groups were eventually starved out or forced to move on, she had built a permanent, sustainable home on the water. She even established floating hospitals on specialized junks, staffed by traditional healers who used the herbs brought by the water train. You hear the rhythmic clink-clunk of the mortar and pestle as they grind ginger and ginseng into healing pastes. The sound of the wounded was not the scream of agony, but the low, rhythmic chanting of prayers to Mazu. This care for the individual was the soft power of the Red Flag, a force that made every pirate feel as though they were part of something sacred. The legal system she developed was also highly nuanced. She didn't just punish crime, she adjudicated civilian disputes. If two pirate families argued over a space on the deck or the ownership of a captured pig, they would bring their case to the table of judgment on the flagship. Zheng Yi Sao sat as the judge, her face a mask of impartial steel. She would listen to the testimonies, the sound of the voices rising and falling in the tonal rhythms of Cantonese, and then she would deliver a verdict that was final and unappealable. The sound of her judgment was the sharp thwack of a wooden fan against her palma sound that signaled the end of the argument and the return to order. As the nights grew longer during the winter monsoon, the fleet would huddle in the sheltered bays of Hainan Island. Here, the sleep factor was at its most profound. The wind would howl through the high palms on the shore, a sound like the rushing of a distant crowd. But inside the protected harbors, the junks remained as still as stones. You hear the soft, rhythmic thump of the anchors hitting the sandy bottom and the long, slow exhale of the entire fleet settling in for the season. The pirates would tell stories of the dragon kings who lived beneath the waves, their voices dropping to a hushed whisper as the fire in the brazier died down to glowing embers. Zheng Yi Sao would use this downtime to plan the next year's tax schedule. She was a woman who never stopped calculating. You see her in the candlelight, her fingers moving over the abacus beads with a hypnotic speed click-clack-click. She was the first person to treat the South China Sea not as a barrier, but as a highway, and she was the one who controlled the tolls. The sound of the abacus was the heartbeat of her empire, a rhythmic reminder that power is built on numbers, and the sovereign of the Red Flag was the master of them all. The section ends with the moon setting over the Hainan bays, the thousands of junks looking like a forest of sleeping giants. The water is dark and deep, the air is cold and clean, and the Red Flag is folded neatly for the night, waiting for the first light of the new season to fly once more over the sovereign sea. The peace of the Golden Age was never destined to last. It was a pressurized silence, a gathering storm. In the forbidden halls of Beijing, the emperor's advisors had finally accepted a humiliating truth. The imperial navy could not defeat the Witch of the South China Sea alone. They turned to the Red Barbarians, the British and the Portuguese, offering them trade concessions and silver in exchange for the heavy fire of their modern warships. You must imagine the shift in the atmosphere of the Delta. The rhythmic, industrious sounds of the pirate Shadow Government were suddenly punctuated by a new, more aggressive noise, the deep, mechanical rumble of European frigates moving into position. These were not the flat-bottomed junks of the coast, but deep-keeled predators of the deep ocean, their hulls made of seasoned oak and their decks bristling with 60 or 80 guns. The British ships, like the Indefatigable, brought with them a different rhythm, the sharp, whistling calls of bosun's pipes and the synchronized heavy thud of hundreds of sailors hauling on canvas lines. Zheng Yi Sao, perched on the high stern of her flagship, observed these movements through a brass telescope. Inside the gate, the pirate fleet remained eerily still. Zheng Yi Sao had ordered a total blackout. No lanterns were lit at night, no drums were beaten. The 80,000 outlaws sat in a silence so profound you could hear the soft, rhythmic clicking of the barnacles against the wooden hulls. Then the spider's strategy was unleashed. Zheng Yi Sao knew she could not win a broadside-to-broadside duel against British oak. She ordered the construction of specialized fire rafts, thousands of small bamboo platforms piled high with kerosene-soaked straw, gunpowder, and dry brush. The smell of these rafts was overwhelming, a thick, oily chemical scent that clung to the water. In the dead of night, during the height of the autumn monsoon, when the wind blew fiercely from the north, she released them. Imagine the sight from the deck of a British frigate. The dark water suddenly erupts into a sea of orange flames. Thousands of fire rafts, tethered together by long hemp ropes, drift down the current like a carpet of burning stars. The sound is a terrifying, rhythmic crackle roar, the heat so intense that the paint on the British hulls begins to blister and peel before the flames even touch them. The European sailors, accustomed to the orderly naval battles of the Atlantic, find themselves in a chaotic hellscape. The sound of their panic is the frantic ringing of the ship's bells and the desperate, splashing sounds of men trying to row away from the encroaching fire. In the chaos, the Red Flag fleet moved. This was the Shadow Strike, the small, fast pirate junks. Their sails painted a dark, non-reflective gray, swarmed through the gaps in the burning rafts. They didn't approach the British ships from the sides. They used the stern blind spot, coming in from behind, where the massive frigates had fewer guns. The sound of the pirate attack was a series of sharp, rhythmic clunks as grappling hooks found purchase on the European railings. The pirates didn't use muskets. They used stinkpots, clay jars filled with sulfur, gunpowder, and rotting organic matter. When these jars shattered on the British decks, they released a cloud of suffocating, foul-smelling smoke that blinded and nauseated the crew. The sensory details of the boarding were a nightmare of contrast. The British decks were a world of white canvas and polished brass, now being invaded by the lean, salt-crusted outlaws of the Red Flag. The sound was the rhythmic shik-shik of the short, heavy pirate swords and the terrifying, silent efficiency of the boarding parties. Zheng Yi Sao had trained her men to work in triads, 3 men moving as one unit, 1 to block, 1 to strike, and 1 to cover. It was a mechanical, lethal choreography. The smell of the battle was a mixture of the oily smoke from the fire rafts and the sharp, coppery scent of fresh blood on the oak planks. The siege lasted for 9 days and nights. The European forces, battered by the fire rafts and decimated by the nitrades, began to realize that the Tiger's Gate was a graveyard of their own making. The sound of the final retreat was the mournful, low-pitched groan of the British anchors being hauled up, a sound of defeat that carried across the water to the cheering pirates. Zheng Yi Sao did not join the cheering. She was already counting the cost. She had lost over 100 junks and nearly 2,000 men. The Red Barbarians had been repelled, but they had proven that the Red Flag was no longer invincible. The era of pure force was ending. The aftermath of the siege brought a new sensory world to the fleet. The air was heavy with the smell of charred wood and the salty, lingering scent of the sea reclaiming the wreckage. The soundscape was the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the carpenters' hammers as they repaired the flagship's hull, and the low, melodic chanting of the priests as they performed the ritual of the sea ghosts for the fallen. Zheng Yi Sao sat in her cabin, her fingers moving over the abacus beads with a new, slower rhythm click-clack. She was calculating a different kind of victory. She realized that the Emperor's alliance with the Europeans was only the beginning. Eventually, the weight of the world would crush the Red Flag if it remained a target. This realization led to her most brilliant and least understood strategy: the slow surrender. She began to encourage a series of internal scuffles between the different colored fleets. She wanted the Emperor to believe the Confederation was fracturing from within. The sound of the fleet was now the sound of artificial discord, loud, theatrical arguments between captains in the ports, and the accidental burning of a few low-value vessels. It was a performance of weakness, designed to draw the government into a negotiation rather than another war. The smell of the fleet was now the scent of feigned rot, a calculated aura of decay. As the nights grew colder, the fleet moved to the hidden bays of the Pearl River's upper reaches. Here, the sleep factor returns. You hear the rhythmic, gentle lapping of the fresh river water against the hulls, a sound that is softer and more musical than the harsh slapping of the salt sea. Zheng Yi Sao remained the eye of the storm, her mind always 3 moves ahead of the Mandarins and the British. You drift into a deep sleep, the rhythmic creaking of the ship's timbers acting as a heartbeat. Knowing that the greatest pirate queen who ever lived is no longer just fighting for the Siege, is fighting for her future. The Battle of the Tiger's Gate was won, but the Battle of the Spirit has only just begun. In the quiet of the freshwater marshes, where the tall reeds hissed against the wooden hulls, with a sound like 1,000 secrets being whispered at once, Zheng Yi Sao began to refine the architecture of the end. She knew that the Qing government was as exhausted as her own men. The imperial treasury was draining faster than the autumn tides, and the red barbarians were demanding more silver for their continued assistance. The sound of the empire was the frantic scratching of pens in the offices of the Governor General of Canton, sound of desperation that she could practically hear across the miles of water. She began to send doves, messengers who were not pirates but respectable merchants since the city. They carried no threats, only questions. The sensory world of these negotiations was a world of tea and silk. Imagine the quiet, high-ceilinged room of a government official, where the air smells of expensive oolong and old ink. The pirate's representative sits perfectly still. The only sound, the rhythmic pouring of the tea into delicate porcelain cups. He suggests that perhaps the Red Flag fleet doesn't need to be destroyed. Perhaps it could be integrated. This was the ultimate heresy, a pirate queen becoming a government official. But Zheng Yi Sao was playing with the emperor's greatest fear, the fear of chaos. She made it known that if the negotiations failed, she would not just raid the coast. She would burn every single rice ship destined for the northern provinces, effectively starving the capital. The sound of the threat was the rhythmic, distant drumming of the pirate war drums, a sound that could be heard from the city walls on clear nights, a reminder that 80,000 blades were still sharp. The transition from the deck of a pirate flagship to the stone quays of Canton is a journey between two entirely different dimensions of existence. As Zheng Yi Sao's small, unescorted boat glides toward the city, the soundscape changes from the organic, percussive rhythms of the fleet to the structured, heavy resonance of imperial power. The walls of Canton rise out of the river like a gray mountain range, cold and indifferent. You hear the rhythmic, metallic clank of the city gates being drawn shut for the night, and the deep, vibrating boom of the evening gong. The air here is different. It lacks the ozonic, moving quality of the open sea. Instead, it is stagnant and heavy, smelling of centuries-old stone, expensive ink, and the oppressive, floral scent of the governor's gardens. Walking through the streets toward the palace, Zheng Yi Sao is a figure of impossible contrast. She wears no armor, no weapons, only a simple, elegant gown of dark silk. Yet, the sound of her footsteps on the polished paving stones is a rhythmic, steady tap. Tap, tap, that commands silence from the crowds. The people of Canton, who have lived in fear of her name for a decade, watch from the shadows of the arched doorways. The air is thick with a hushed, vibrating tension. They expect a monster. They see a woman who carries herself with a grace that exceeds the most refined lady of the court. This is her first move in the psychological duel, to prove that she is not a barbarian to be slaughtered, but a sovereign to be reckoned with. The Governor General's palace is a labyrinth of sensory barriers. You hear the rhythmic scuff-scuff of the guards' boots on the marble floors, and the high-pitched musical tinkling of the wind chimes in the courtyards. Each room she enters is more opulent and more claustrophobic than the last. The smell is an intoxicating, thick cloud of sandalwood and jasmine incense, designed to overwhelm the senses and project the timelessness of the Qing dynasty. But Zheng Yi Sao has lived in the three voids of the sea. She is not easily distracted. She reaches the inner sanctum where Governor General.By waits. He is a man of the old world, surrounded by scrolls, brushes, and the heavy silence of bureaucracy. The negotiation is a battle of silences. You hear the rhythmic, slow pouring of tea sound like a tiny, domestic waterfall. Bai Ling refuses to look at her at first, attempting to diminish her presence with his indifference. The only sound is the rhythmic click of his long fingernails against the porcelain cup. But Zheng Yi Sao understands the power of the empty space. She sits in absolute stillness, her breathing so slow and rhythmic that it begins to influence the governor's own pulse. She doesn't speak of mercy, she speaks of math. She reminds him of the cost of the Lantau siege. She reminds him that while he sits in this palace, 80,000 men are waiting for a signal. If she does not return, the Pearl River will turn red with the fire of 1,000 burning rice ships. The sound of her voice is a revelation, is calm, melodic, and carries the weight of the deep ocean. She proposes a solution that is as brilliant as it is audacious. She will agree to the amnesty, but the pirates will not kneel as criminals. Instead, they will be retired as heroes of the coast. She demands that her men be allowed to keep their loot, that they be given land, and most importantly, that her second-in-command and adopted son, Chung Po Sai, be given a commission as a colonel in the Imperial Navy. This is a masterstroke. She is not surrendering her power, she is selling it to the emperor in exchange for a legitimate future. The sensory details of the palace at night during these negotiations are haunting. You hear the rhythmic, lonely cry of a night watchman's rattle in the distance. The shadows cast by the flickering oil lamps dance on the silk screens, looking like the bat-wing sails of her fleet. The Governor General is trapped. He knows that to execute her is to invite a war he cannot win. But to agree to her terms is to admit that the empire is no longer supreme. The smell of the room becomes more acidic, the scent of cold sweat and dying lamps. Finally, the sound of the resolution arrives, the rhythmic SHS-HSH of a brush on a formal scroll. The Governor General signs the decree, but there is one final, symbolic hurdle. The law requires that all surrendered pirates must kneel before the authorities. To Zheng Yi Sao, this is an unacceptable loss of face. She proposes one last, poetic compromise. She and her officers will be married to their wives in a massive formal ceremony overseen by the Governor General himself. In the Chinese tradition, the couple must kneel to the official performing the ceremony. By doing so, they will technically kneel before the government, satisfying the law, while the world sees only a wedding. The sound of this proposal is a sudden, sharp intake of breath from the governor. He realizes he has met his match. The journey back to the fleet is a triumphant, rhythmic procession. As her boat exits the city gates and enters the open water, the sea sound returns. You hear the rhythmic, powerful slapping of the waves against the hull and the first distant cheers of the red flag lookouts. The air is fresh again, smelling of salt and freedom. She returns to her flagship not as a captive, but as a liberator. The sound of the fleet is a deafening, rhythmic roar, the sound of 80,000 voices chanting her name. The red flag is lowered for the last time, not in defeat, but in transition. The sensory immersion of the Great Surrender is the most profound moment in her story. Imagine thousands of pirate junks sailing into the harbor of Canton, their bat-wing sails furled. The sound is the collective, rhythmic clunk of 10,000 anchors hitting the mud at the same time. The pirates walk onto the shore, not in chains, but in their finest silks. They carry their silver in heavy chests, the rhythmic thump-thump of the bearer's footsteps echoing through the city. It is the largest retirement party in human history. The smell of the city is transformed into a carnival of street food, grilled squid, sweet ginger cakes, and the sharp, celebratory scent of firecrackers. Zheng Yi Sao herself leads the procession to the temple for the mass wedding. The soundscape is a riot of gongs, drums, and the high-pitched singing of the opera troops. She wears a wedding gown of the most brilliant red, the color of her fleet, embroidered with gold dragons. As she kneels before the Governor General, the silence that falls over Canton is absolute. It is the silence of an era ending. The Witch of the South China Sea has become a lady of the empire. The rhythmic thud of her knees hitting the temple floor is the final punctuation mark on her life as an outlaw. But even in retirement, her presence remains. She settles into a large estate in Canton, where she opens a successful gambling house. You hear the rhythmic clack-clack of the mahjong tiles, a sound that mirrors the clicking of her old abacus. The smell of her home is a mixture of expensive tea and the lingering, ghostly scent of the sea breeze that still blows in from the delta. She is a woman who has found the ultimate peace, the peace of a winner. She lived to a ripe old age, saw her children grow, and died in her own bed, surrounded by the wealth she had taken from the world and the respect she had forced it to give her. As you drift into a deep sleep, the image of Zheng Yi Sao remains not as a pirate, but as a master of the tide. The water of the Pearl River is quiet now, the lanterns of the city reflecting on the surface like fallen stars. You hear the rhythmic, gentle breathing of the city, a sound of peace that was bought with the sovereign's brilliance. The red flag is gone, but the sovereign remains in the very air of the delta. The water is deep, the moon is full, and the Queen of Pirates has finally found her shore. The transition from the salt-crusted deck of a warship to the polished cedar floors of a Canton estate is not merely a change of location. It is the final evolution of a strategist who realized that power in its purest form does not require a cannon. You must imagine the sensory environment of Zheng Yi Sao's retirement as a world of refined, rhythmic precision. The air of her mansion, situated near the bustling ports she once blockaded, is thick with the scent of expensive silver needle tea and the sweet, resinous smell of aged agar-wood incense. Here, the roar of the South China Sea is replaced by a more subtle sound, the rhythmic, percussive clack-clack-lick of mahjong tiles and the dry, paper-thin shuffle of cards. She has traded the red flag for the green felt of the gambling tables, but the mind behind the movement remains as sharp as a pirate's cutlass. In the 19th century, a gambling house in Canton was not merely a den of vice. It was a social hub, a bank, and an intelligence center. Zheng Yi Sao understood that the men who controlled the flow of money, the merchants, the tax collectors, and the foreign traders, eventually found their way to the table. She sat in the center of this web, a quiet, elegant figure in charcoal silk, her eyes observing the tells of her guests with the same intensity she once used to read the weather before a battle. The soundscape of her house was a carefully managed symphony. You hear the rhythmic, melodic plink of water falling into a stone basin in the interior garden, a sound designed to mask the whispers of men discussing business in the private rooms. This was her quiet empire, where information was the currency and her past was her greatest asset. Her life is found in the meticulous order she maintained. Even on land, the code of the red flag lived on in the way she managed her staff and her ventures. There was no chaos in her house. Every servant moved with a rhythmic, silent efficiency. Every ledger was balanced with the same mathematical rigor she had applied to the 8 fleets. You hear the rhythmic scritch-scratch of her brush as she records the night's takes. She was one of the first to realize that gambling is not a game of luck, but a game of percentages and human psychology. While the men at her tables chased the big win, she was content with the steady cut. The smell of her office was a mixture of old ink and the metallic, cold scent of silver coins, a scent that signaled her continued sovereignty over the flow of wealth. But the sea never truly left her. On nights when the autumn monsoon blew particularly hard, rattling the heavy wooden shutters of her estate, you might imagine her standing on the upper balcony, looking out toward the dark line of the horizon. The sound of the wind in the bamboo groves around her house was a terrestrial echo of the wind in the batwing sails. The sensory memory of the salt spray and the thunder of the long guns was etched into her very bones. She watched as her second-in-command and husband, Chung Po-sai, rose through the ranks of the Imperial Navy, using the very tactics she had taught him to hunt down the smaller, disorganized pirate groups that had refused to surrender. There was a profound, rhythmic irony in this. The red flag was now the law of the sea, enforced by the very men who had once defied it. The social atmosphere of her life in Canton was one of legendary distance. She was a celebrity and a pariah, a woman who had humiliated the emperor and then walked into his city to claim her reward. The sound of the city's gossip was a constant, low-frequency rhythmic whispering that followed her whenever she traveled in her closed palanquin. You hear the rhythmic thud-thud of the bearer's feet and the occasional sharp clack of a fan being opened by a curious onlooker. But she never engaged with the spectacle. She remained a ghost of the water, a woman who had seen the world from the heights of a flagship and found the land to be a small, cramped place in comparison. Her legacy began to take root in the very maritime laws she had once broken. The protection passports she had issued were studied by the British East India Company as early examples of maritime insurance and convoy systems. The sound of her history was now being recorded in the libraries of Europe and Asia. You hear the rhythmic turning of the pages of the British naval reports, where officers who had once feared her name now wrote about her with a grudging, clinical respect. They called her the most successful pirate in history, a title that she would have likely greeted with a quiet, knowing smile. To her, it wasn't about the title. It was about the survival of the 80,000 and the securing of her own path. The sensory details of her later years are those of a woman who has found a different kind of the space between the worlds. She lived in a house filled with the treasures of her raids, yet she lived simply. The smell of her tea, the texture of her silk, and the rhythmic sound of her prayer beads became the boundaries of her world. You hear the rhythmic click-click-click of the sandalwood beads as she performed her morning devotions to Mizu, the goddess of the sea. This was the same goddess the pirates had prayed to before battle, and now, in the quiet of a Canton morning, Zheng Yi Sao thanked her for the calm, The air was filled with the smell of the morning mist rising from the river, a scent of beginnings and endings. As she aged, her mind remained an abacus of strategy. She saw the Opium Wars beginning to brew on the horizon. The sound of the British steamship's new rhythmic chug-chug, chugzling, the end of the age of the sail. She knew that the world she had mastered was disappearing, replaced by iron and steam. But she had exited at the perfect moment. She had taken the red flag and turned it into gold, and then turned that gold into time. This was her final victory over the Emperor. She outlived most of her enemies and all of her critics. The sound of her longevity was the slow, steady heartbeat of a woman who refused to be a tragedy. The end of her life was as orderly as her code. She died in 1844 at the age of 69, surrounded by her family and her wealth. You must imagine the final sensory moments in her room. The sound is the rhythmic, shallow breathing of an old woman, a sound that is as steady and inevitable as the tide. The window is open, and the scent of the Pearl River, the silt, the salt, and the wood smoke drifts in on the breeze. It is a homecoming. She is no longer the witch or the sovereign. She is the water returning to the spring. The last sound she hears is the distant, rhythmic creak of a boat or on the river, a sound that she had followed her entire life. As you drift into a deep, restorative sleep, the image of Zheng Yi Sao remains as a testament to the power of a disciplined mind. The South China Sea is a vast, dark mirror, reflecting the stars and the history of those who dared to command it. You hear the rhythmic, gentle lapping of the waves against a wooden hull, a sound that is both a memory and a promise. The sovereign is at rest, her ledgers closed, her cannons silent, and her story etched into the very movement of the tides. The water is deep, the moon is hidden, and the journey of the Queen of Pirates has reached its final peaceful shore. With the surrender of the Red Flag fleet, a peculiar and heavy silence descended upon the Pearl River Delta, silence that felt less like peace and more like the holding of a collective breath. For over a decade, the rhythmic pulse of the South China Sea had been dictated by the code and the bat-wing sails of 80,000 outlaws. Now, as the last of the pirate junks were repurposed into merchant vessels or left to rot in the silt of the upper tributaries, the geography itself seemed to mourn. You must imagine the sensory world of this transition. The once vibrant Ladrone Islands, which had hummed with the sound of pirate blacksmiths and the laughter of seafaring families, were suddenly reclaimed by the high whistling wind and the rhythmic crash hiss of the waves against empty limestone cliffs. The smell of the islands shifted from wood smoke and grilled fish back to the raw, ozonic scent of salt and sun-scorched rock. The power vacuum left by Zheng Yi Sao was not filled by the Imperial Qing Navy, but by a new, more mechanical rhythm. The British East India Company, no longer checked by the crescent formations of the Red Flag, began to assert a different kind of dominance. You hear the first rhythmic chug-chug thump of the early steam vessels, the Nemesis and the Phlegethon. These were the harbingers of a new era. Unlike the junks, which moved with the organic grace of the wind and the tide, these iron-hulled monsters moved with a relentless, vibrating energy that shook the very water around them. The smell of the delta began to change. The sweet scent of tea and the earthy smell of river silt were increasingly masked by the thick, acrid stench of burning coal and the hot, oily aroma of steam engines. Zheng Yi Sao, watching from her balcony in Canton, would have heard these new sounds with a profound understanding of their meaning. She had managed the sea like a ledger, and she could see that the balance of power was shifting toward those who could ignore the wind. The sensory details of the Canton waterfront during this era became a riot of clashing civilizations. You hear the rhythmic, barking commands of British naval officers, the high-pitched bargaining of opium traders, and the low-frequency, melancholic chanting of the coolies as they loaded the foreign mud onto the wharves. The air was thick with the smell of the opium itself, heavy, sweet, and cloying scent that seemed to dull the senses of the city. This was the new sea, a world where the sovereign's code was being replaced by the rule of the gunboat. The pirate confederation had been a shield of the coast, an informal barrier that kept the Western powers at bay. Without the red flag to guard the estuaries, the black wind of the Opium Wars began to blow with a lethal consistency. You hear the rhythmic, terrifying boom of the British 68-pounder cannons, a sound far more resonant and destructive than the bronze guns of the pirates. The water of the Pearl River, once the sovereign's domain, was now a highway for the ironclads. The sensory experience of the river at night was no longer one of flickering pirate lanterns, but of the cold, sweeping searchlights of the patrolling British frigates. The unseen eye of the pirates had been replaced by the all-seeing eye of the Empire. The decline of the junk fleets was a slow, rhythmic, vanishing act. One by one, the great shipyards of Canton and Macau began to fall silent. You hear the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of a single carpenter's mallet, where once there were thousands. The smell of the Chunum waterproof paste, that sharp, acidic scent of the Golden Age, was replaced by the smell of iron rust and coal-ash. The floating people, the boat-dwellers, who had once looked to Zheng Yi Sao for protection, found themselves marginalized by the new regulations of the foreign ports. Their soundscape was one of displacement. You hear the rhythmic splash of their oars as they were forced further into the mosquito-infested marshes, away from the lucrative trade routes. Yet, even in this era of decline, the ghost of the red flag lingered in the collective memory of the coast. The sailors and fishermen still told stories of the woman who tamed the tide in the small, smoke-filled tea-houses of the back alleys. You hear the rhythmic clack of teacups being set down as elders whispered about the time the sovereign turned the Tiger's Gate into a ring of fire. The smell of these stories was the scent of nostalgia, mixture of cheap tobacco, and the salt air of memory. They spoke of her not as a criminal, but as the last defender of the southern water, a woman who had seen the change coming and had the wisdom to walk away before the world turned to iron. The darkness here is absolute, far from the lights of the nightless city of Canton. You hear the rhythmic, mournful cry of the wind through the collapsed stone arches and the soft, steady shush of the tide reclaiming the sandy coves. There is a peace here that is ancient and cold. The water doesn't care about steam or iron. It only cares about the pull of the moon and the rhythm of the depths. When the red flag was lowered, the code of Zheng Yi Sao did not vanish into the silt of the Pearl River. It migrated. You must imagine the sensory transition of this power from the loud, thunderous decree of the flagship deck to the hushed, rhythmic murmurs of the clan halls. her code had provided them with something the Qing Empire never could: a system of social justice for the voiceless. The sound of her legacy was the rhythmic clack of the abacus in the clan's mutual aid funds, ensuring that no widow of a sailor went hungry and no orphan was left without a boat. She had taught the floating people that they were a nation, and that nation outlived the red flag. The sensory details of these hidden halls are a study in living history. The walls were often lined with spirit tablets, small, rectangular pieces of wood inscribed with the names of the departed. Among them, though often hidden behind silk curtains to avoid the eyes of government spies, was the tablet of the sovereign. You hear the rhythmic, gentle shsh of a silk broom sweeping the stone floor, a sound of constant, quiet maintenance. The air was cool and still, a sanctuary from the tropical heat of the delta. The smell of the hall was a mixture of old paper, cold stone, and the faint ozone scent of the river that always managed to find its way through the cracks. This was the heart of the dragon, where the sovereign's mind continued to govern the rhythms of the people. The code's influence on the treatment of women was perhaps its most enduring rhythmic pulse. But before Zheng Yi Sao, the women of the delta were often seen as extra mouths to be sold or traded. Her law that a man must be faithful to his wife and that no woman should be taken by force became a cornerstone of maritime morality. You hear the rhythmic, domestic sounds of the boat communities, the clinking of coins being managed by the women, the thud-thud of mallets as they repaired the nets, and the high-pitched singing of the saltwater songs. In these songs, the sovereign was often coded as a goddess or a seabird, a protector of the feminine spirit in a world of men. The sound of her legacy was the sound of a woman's voice, clear and unafraid, rising over the noise of the waves. The protection passport system also evolved into a sophisticated network of guilds. These guilds, based on her administrative model, controlled the transport of salt, tea, and silk across the delta for decades. You hear the rhythmic, percussive thump-thump of the guild stamps being pressed into bills of lading, a sound of legitimacy and trust. The merchants of the 1830s and 40s still preferred the pirate's handshake over the imperial law, because the code was consistent. It was a world of rhythmic predictability in an age of colonial chaos. The smell of these guild offices was the scent of stable trade, the dry aroma of stored tea, and the clean, sharp scent of fresh ink. Zheng Yi Sao had proven that order was more profitable than plunder, a lesson that the maritime world never forgot. As the evening mist rolls into the Pearl River, the sleep factor returns to the boatful. Thousands of small sampans are lashed together, creating a floating tapestry of life that mirrors the formation of the old Red Flag fleet. You hear the rhythmic, gentle rocking of the boats in the Tea, movement that is as old as the river itself. The soundscape is one of collective rest, the soft, rhythmic clatter of bowls being put away, the low-pitched conversations of families, and the distant, haunting melody of a moonlute being played on a nearby junk. These people were the descendants of her 80,000, and they still lived by the law of the tide. You need the red flag to fly for them to know that they belonged to the sovereign. Zheng Yi Sao's transition from a living leader to a cultural rhythm was completed in the rituals of the sea. Whenever a new junk was launched, the ceremony involved the tying of the red ribbon, a rhythmic, symbolic act that harked back to the colors of her fleet. You hear the rhythmic crack-pop of celebratory firecrackers and the deep, vibrating boom of the ship's gong. The smell of the ceremony was a mixture of fresh sawdust and the bitter, cleansing scent of rice wine poured over the bow. The sovereign was not dead. She was integrated. She was the rhythm of the oar, the tension of the sail, and the cold, calculating eye of the navigator. The sensory immersion of the new maritime order was a study in resilience. While the British steamships owned the outer water, the clans owned the inner water. They used the shallow channels and the hidden tributaries where the ironclads could not go. You hear the rhythmic, silent creak of the ULO oars as the clan boats moved through the darkness, carrying the trade of the nation beneath the noses of the foreign patrols. This was the guerrilla economy of the sovereign. The smell of these nitrons was the scent of the hidden sea, muddy, cool, and filled with the promise of survival. The code provided the trust that made this shadow empire possible. Inside the clan halls, the storytelling tradition kept her memory alive as a rhythmic epic. You hear the voices of the elders, rising and falling in the tonal patterns of Cantonese, recounting the 300 days of the Great Blockade or the 70 fires of Lantau. These stories were not just entertainment. They were the oral archive of the people. The sound was the rhythmic clack of a wooden fan hitting a table, marking the moments of victory and the moments of loss. The children listened in the shadows, their eyes reflecting the flickering light of the incense coils. They were learning the most important lesson of the sovereign, that power is not about the crown you wear, but about the rhythm you set for others to follow. Her legacy is found in the way she reconciled the sea with the land. She had shown that the floating people were not outcasts, but the true owners of the coast. You hear the rhythmic, steady breathing of the delta at night-a sound of immense, quiet endurance. The water is a dark, moving mirror, carrying the reflections of the past into the future. You are safe in the clanhold, protected by the unseen code and the ancestral spirit of the red flag. The sound of the river is a lullaby of history, a rhythmic reminder that even when the flags are lowered, the sovereign's mind remains in the movement of the waves. This spirit of the code was most visible during the festival of the Sea Queen, where the maritime communities gathered to honor. Mizzou, you must imagine the sight of thousands of small boats congregating in a single bay, their lanterns creating a second sky on the water. The sound was a massive, rhythmic, thrummed a collective voice of the sea people singing the hymns of the sovereign's era. The smell was a thick, sweet cloud of thousand-year-old incense and the savory aroma of grand banquet dishes shared between boats. This was the ultimate social rhythm, a moment where the hierarchy of the land was forgotten and the equality of the red flag was briefly reborn. Zheng Yi Sao's ghost was present in the way the boats were lashed together, the floating city returning for a single night of remembrance. You hear the rhythmic, playful slap of children's feet on the wooden decks and the deep, resonant laughter of the elders as they watched the next generation. The sound of the festival was the sound of invincibility, the realization that while empires fall and foreign ships come and go, the people of the red flag sovereign remain. They are the water, and the water always returns to the shore. As the smoke of the Opium Wars began to drift toward the horizon, the story of the red flag sovereign began a secondary, more silent journey and migration of information that crossed the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and landed in the bustling, ink-stained newsrooms of London, Paris, and Philadelphia. You must imagine the sensory environment of this global echo, not the salt spray of the Delta. In the 1830s and 40s, news traveled at the speed of a sailing ship, and by the time the details of Zheng Yi Sao's career reached the Western public, they arrived with the weight of a legend already formed. The sound of her name in the drawing rooms of the Victorian era was a rhythmic, hushed whisper, a sound of disbelief and fascination. To hear of a woman who commanded 80,000 outlaws and 1,000 ships was to hear of a reality that defied the European imagination. The contrast between the wild, maritime reality of China and the structured, intellectualized world of the West. You hear the rhythmic, polite tink of silver spoons against porcelain in a London tea room, where the air smells of Earl Grey and coal fire. Here, the sovereign's code was analyzed by gentlemen who had never seen the South China Sea. Yet they recognized in her laws a sophisticated bureaucracy that mirrored their own admiralty. The sound of her legacy in the West was the rhythmic shuff-shuff of newspaper pages being turned in the quiet of a gentleman's club. The sensory immersion of the Western discovery was a study in cultural shock. The British officers who had faced her at the Tiger's Gate returned home with memoirs that were serialized in magazines like Blackwood's. You hear the rhythmic, scratching sound of a quill pen across parchment as a naval lieutenant attempts to describe the sight of 1,000 bat-wing sails silhouetted against a Cantonese dawn. He writes of the rhythmic, terrifying discipline of the Red Flag, a discipline that Westerners associated only with the Royal Navy. The smell of these accounts was the scent of old leather-bound books and the faint, dusty aroma of archives. To the British public, she was the Pirate Queen, a title that carried both terror and a strange, romantic allure. She was the anti-heroine who had successfully said no to the Empire. Inside the lecture halls of Paris, the sovereign's career was used as a case study in social contract theory. Philosophers debated her code as if it were a lost work of Rousseau. You hear the rhythmic, echoing thump of a lecturer's cane on the floorboards as he emphasizes the point that Zheng Yi Sao had created a republic of the waves. The air in these halls was thick with the smell of pipe tobacco and floor wax. The story of her surrender, the clever marriage ceremony that bypassed the ritual of kneeling, was told as a masterpiece of Eastern diplomacy. The sound of the audience's reaction was a rhythmic, collective murmur of appreciation for a woman who had outsmarted a governor general. She was becoming a myth of the intellect, a ghost of a sovereign who had mastered the art of face in America. The news of the Red Flag sovereign arrived at the docks of Salem and Boston, brought by the China traders who had seen her yellow-flagged passports with their own eyes. You hear the rhythmic, heavy thud of tea crates being unloaded and the melodic, rhythmic chanting of the sailors as they worked the capstans. The smell of the American docks was a mixture of pintar, salt cod, and the intoxicating, spicy scent of the Far East. For the Americans, she was a symbol of mercantile independence. They saw in her a woman who had broken a monopoly and built her own empire from the silt of a river. The sound of her story in the American press was the rhythmic, loud bang of the broadside presses, churning out cheap penny dreadfuls that embellished her life with tales of hidden treasure and dark romance. The sensory details of the mythic sovereign were often more vivid than the reality. In the Western imagination, her flagship was a floating palace of ebony and gold. Her cannons were cast from the silver of captured Spanish galleons, and she herself was a vengeful sea spirit in robes of blood-red silk. You hear the rhythmic, haunting music of the Victorian stage, where plays were written about her life, the high-pitched, dramatic twang of the violins and the deep, percussive boom of the stage drums representing the Battle of Lantau. The smell of these theaters was a mixture of lamp oil, perfume, and the excitement of a public hungry for the exotic. She was no longer just a person. She was a spectacle, a projection of Western fears and desires about the mystic East. Yet, beneath the spectacle, the legacy of strategy remained. The British Admiralty quietly studied her fleet formations and her use of fire rafts. You hear the rhythmic, quiet clink of brass dividers against a nautical chart in a room in Whitehall, where senior officers attempted to map her movements during the blockade. The air was cool and smelled of the Thames and old paper. They recognized that the Red Flag sovereign had perfected a form of asymmetric warfare that would trouble the Royal Navy for a century to be. The sound of their analysis was the rhythmic, dry SHS, HSH of maps being rolled and unrolled. She had taught the masters of the sea a lesson in humility, and that lesson was recorded in the secret files of the Empire. As the 19th century drew to a close, she was featured in children's books and sailors' yarns from Liverpool to San Francisco. You hear the rhythmic, low-frequency creak of a rocking chair as a grandfather tells a child about the woman who commanded the 80,000. The soundscape is one of domestic peace, the crackle of a fire, the soft, rhythmic breathing of a child, and the distant, rhythmic tolling of a church bell. The sovereign had been tamed by history, her violence forgotten, her brilliance celebrated as a fairy tale of the sea. The smell of these stories was the scent of safe adventure, the smell of a warm room and a story that ends with a peaceful retirement. As the world entered the age of steam and telegraphs, the rhythmic memory of Zheng Yi Sao stayed behind in the age of the sail. She became the guardian of the Golden Age, the last great figure of a world where the wind was the only master. You hear the rhythmic, fading hiss of the steam valves on a modern liner, a sound that signals the final departure of the junk era. But in the libraries and the archives, her code remained, a rhythmic pulse of order in a world of water. The sound of her history was the rhythmic, steady tick-tick-tick of the library clock, marking the passage of time as her legend grew more stable and more profound. She was the one who had won the sea, and the world could not forget her. This intellectual legacy was particularly strong among the maritime philosophers of the late Victorian era. They saw in her code a blueprint for a new kind of oceanic governance. You must imagine the quiet, dust-moted sunlight of a university library, where the air is heavy with the smell of vellum and woodrot. You hear the rhythmic, slow thump of a massive tome being opened, the annals of the Qing maritime history. The scholar's fingers trace the lines of her laws, his mind marveling at the rhythmic precision of her system of weights and measures for the loot. She had achieved what the great trade companies could only hope for: absolute, uncorruptible internal honesty through fear and organization. The sound of this discovery was the rhythmic, soft scratching of a lead pencil making notes in the margina sound of academic respect. The maritime myths also evolved into a form of sailors' folklore in the forecastles of the American clippers, where the men sat in the dim light of a swinging lantern. The story of the sovereign was told as a cautionary tale of female power. You hear the rhythmic, heavy creak of the ship's hull as it leans into a gale, and the rhythmic slosh of the grog in a wooden bucket. The The sailors believed that the sovereign had a sea god's eye that could see through the thickest fog, and a silver voice that could calm the roughest storm. The smell of these tales was the scent of sea magic, a mixture of wet wool, tobacco, and the ozone of a coming storm. To the common sailor, she wasn't a politician. She was a force of nature, a woman who had mastered the very elements they were struggling to survive. Zheng Yi Sao's global echo reached its final rhythmic peak in the early days of cinema, where her legend was transformed into the first pirate queen of the silver screen. You hear the rhythmic mechanical whir of the early projectors and the tinkling rhythmic music of the silent film piano. The audience watched in awe as a flickering black and white image of a woman in silk stood on the deck of a great junk, commanding the waves. The smell was the scent of popcorn and celluloid, a new, modern sensory world that took the sovereign and turned her into an icon. She was no longer just a memory. She was a moving image, a rhythmic presence that could be seen by millions. To understand the woman who commanded 80,000 souls, one must eventually leave the thunder of the cannons. In the final decade of her life, Zheng Yi Sao lived in a state of deliberate presence, a philosophy she referred to as the balance of the void and the abacus. You must imagine the sensory environment of her Canton, a state at the edge of the river, a place where the air was filtered through the thick, green leaves of ancient banyan trees and the sharp, clean scent of blooming gardenias. The soundscape here was a masterpiece of negative space. The roar of the South China Sea had been distilled into the rhythmic, melodic plink-plank of a bamboo waterspout filling a stone basin. To her, the void was the silence of the sea before a storm, and the abacus was the rigorous order required to navigate it. She rose before the sun, at the hour of the tiger, when the city of Canton was still a world of gray mist and muffled echoes. You hear the rhythmic, soft swish of her silk robes as she walked the perimeter of her garden, her feet making no sound on the moss-covered stones. She used a tea set made of dehua, porcelain white as bone and smooth as sea glass. The steam rose in a delicate, rhythmic spiral, carrying the scent of Iron Goddess of Mercy Oolonga roasted, floral aroma that grounded her in the present. She would sit for hours, watching the shadows of the leaves move across the stone floor of the veranda. To an onlooker, she appeared idle, but her mind was engaged in the void, a state of wordless observation where she mapped the shifting political currents of the Qing Empire as if they were sandbars in the delta. The sound of her piece was the rhythmic, distant caw of a crane and the soft, steady murmur of the river beyond the walls. In the afternoons, she would often receive visitors, former pirates who had fallen on hard times, or young merchants seeking her counsel. The sound of these meetings was a study in rhythmic authority. She didn't speak much, she listened. You hear the rhythmic clack of her fan as she opened and closed it, a punctuation mark for her thoughts. The air in the reception hall was thick with the smell of sandalwood incense, a scent that signaled the transition from business to wisdom. She would offer advice that was always rooted in the code. Be faithful to your word. Manage your resources like a fleet, and never mistake the wind for the destination. The sound of her voice was a low-frequency, musical resonance, a sound that carried the authority of a woman who had seen the bottom of the ocean and the height of the sky. The philosophy of the void was most evident in her relationship with her past. She did not keep trophies of her raids. She kept vessels of memory. In her garden, she had a single, weather-beaten anchor from her first flagship, now covered in climbing jasmine. You hear the rhythmic, metallic tink of the jasmine vines against the rusted iron in the breeze. The smell was a mixture of the floral and the industrial, a sensory representation of her own life. She would touch the cold iron and feel the rhythm of the Lantau battle, the vibration of the cannons, and the cries of the men. But she felt it with the detachment of a mountain watching a storm. She had integrated the violence into the void, turning her scars into the architecture of her strength. The Abacus of the Soul was her final project. She spent the last years of her life writing her memoirs, not for the public, but for her children. You hear the rhythmic, dry SHSHSH of the brush against the rice paper. She wrote in a script that was tight and disciplined, a visual representation of her mind. She wrote about the rhythm of the sea, how the water is never still, yet never lost. She wrote about the abacus of the heart, how every act of cruelty must be balanced by an act of mercy if the soul is to remain buoyant. The smell of her writing room was the scent of preserved wisdom, the smell of wood ash ink, and the dry, papery scent of the past. Nothing moved her to anger or haste. She had mastered the internal tide. You hear the rhythmic, slow ticking of her European clocks, a sound that she used as a metronome for her own heartbeat. You hear the rhythmic, soft crackle of the small charcoal brazier in her room, a sound of warmth in the winter dark. she saw the batwing sails in the flickering shadows on the wall. She heard the 5 watches of the fleet in the rhythmic tolling of the city's temple bells. She was at peace because she had accounted for everything. The section immersion concludes with the image of her garden at midnight, under a hunter's moon. The water in the stone basin is perfectly still, reflecting the moon like a silver coin on a black cloth. The sound is the rhythmic, absolute silence of a world that has been mastered. The air is cold and smells of the first frost and the distant sea. The sovereign is asleep, her abacus put away, her void filled with the light of a life well lived. You drift into the deepest sleep, the rhythmic pulse of her garden, acting as a bridge to the world of history. The water is deep, the sovereign is still, and the red flag is a shadow in the moonlight. To truly inhabit her mind during these final years, one must understand her theology of the tide. She believed that the sea was not a place, but a state of being. This belief was reflected in the very structure of her home. She had the floor tiles of her veranda laid in a rhythmic, wave-like pattern of alternating gray and blue stone. You hear the rhythmic, hollow click of her wooden sandals as she walked these waves, a sound that echoed the rhythmic movement of the fleet. The sensory experience of her home was a constant, subtle reminder that life is a fluid, moving thing. The void was the space between the waves, and her life was the movement itself. This philosophy extended to her treatment of time. She didn't view time as a linear progression, but as a rhythmic cycle. She measured her days by the tides of the Pearl River, even though she no longer sailed them. You hear the rhythmic, low-frequency rumble of the river as it rose and fell against the stone embankments of her estate. This was the clock of the sovereign. She ate when the tide was coming in. She meditated when the tide was going out. This synchronization with the natural world gave her an aura of timelessness. The people who met her in her 60s said she looked as if she had been carved from the very cliffs of the Ladrone Islands, weathered yet indestructible. The scent of the void was the scent of her private meditation chamber. It was a room with no windows, lit only by a single rhythmic flame of an oil lamp. The walls were painted a deep matte black, absorbing all light. The smell was a mixture of cold stone and old earth, a scent that stripped away the distractions of the material world. Here she would sit in the absence of sound, listening only to the rhythmic internal pulse of her own blood. This was where she faced the ghosts of the red flag. She didn't flee from them, she invited them in. She counted the lives lost in her name on the abacus of her mind, balancing each one with a prayer or a deed of charity. This spiritual accounting was the most difficult work of her life, but it was the work that allowed her to sleep in peace. As the light of her final afternoon faded into a bruised purple and orange, she called her children to her side. She didn't give them gold, she gave them her abacus and her inkstone. She told them that the secret to power is not in the sword, but in the rhythm of the mind. You hear the rhythmic, shallow breathing of the sovereign as she closed her eyes for the last time. The sound was as steady and inevitable as the tide going out for the final time. The smell of the room was the scent of jasmine and salt, the scent of a life that had spanned the river and the sea. When a force as massive as the Red Flag fleet vanishes from the physical world, it does not truly disappear. It displaces into the world of the spirit. Following the death of Zheng Yi Sao, the South China Sea became a landscape of acoustic shadows and visual echoes. Time when the old sailors began to report sightings of the ghost fleet moving through the mist. The air of the Ladrone Islands, once smelling of wood smoke and silver, began to carry a different, colder scent. The smell of old salt and sunken cedar. The soundscape was no longer one of living battle, but of rhythmic absence. You hear the distant phantom creak of a bamboo sail and the low vibrational hum of 80,000 voices caught in the wind. This was the birth of the supernatural sovereign, a legend that turned the queen of pirates into a permanent guardian of the deep. In the small fishing villages of Hainan, the nights are governed by the Ghost Watch. You are sitting on a wooden pier, the water of the bay as black as ink. The sound is the rhythmic, gentle slap-slap of the tide against the pilings. Suddenly, the air grows cold, and a thick, silver mist rolls in from the sea. The sound is the rhythmic, muffled thud-thud of a phantom drum, beating out the 5 watches of the sovereign. This is a sound of comfort, not terror. It is the realization that the red flag still patrols the boundaries of the world, protecting the floating people from the ghosts of the deep. You enter one of these shrines at dusk. The air is heavy and intoxicating, smelling of sea-scented incense, a blend of dried seaweed, sandalwood, and salt crust. You hear the rhythmic, delicate crinkle of the paper as the boats are prepared. The smell is the scent of glutinous rice, glue, and fresh paint. At midnight, these paper ships are lit with small candles and released into the current. The sound is the rhythmic, soft shisses of the paper burning and the gentle hushing of the river as it carries the flames away. This was a way of feeding the ghost fleet, ensuring that the spirits of the 80,000 remained satiated and peaceful. The sight of 1,000 burning paper ships drifting toward the ocean is a hypnotic, rhythmic dance of light and shadow. The sensory details of the sunken ledger were another layer of the myth. It was rumored that, before her death, Zheng Yi Sao had cast her grand abacus and her iron ledger into the deepest part of the Pearl River. The legend stated that the beads of the abacus would continue to click, calculating the debt the world owed to the sea. You hear the rhythmic, underwater click-clack in the bubbles of the river, a sound that divers claimed to hear during the low tide. The smell of the river bottom was the scent of cold silt and ancient metal, a smell of permanence and weight. This sunken logic gave the people a sense of cosmic justice. They believed that even if the land laws were corrupt, the law of the water was still being calculated beneath the waves. In the 20th century, the Ghost Fleet transitioned into the world of modern memory. During the dark days of the World Wars, the boat people of the Delta claimed that the Red Flag sovereign returned to guide their sampans through the minefields and the blockades. You hear the rhythmic, low-frequency chug of a modern engine, and then, suddenly, the rhythmic, silent slide of a junk moving alongside. The smell was the scent of old-world jasmine cutting through the stench of diesel and oil. The sovereign had become a multiversal protector, a figure that existed outside of time, appearing whenever the people of the water were in peril. The sound of her intervention was the rhythmic, steady beat of a drum that seemed to come from the water itself. The pirate temples evolved as well, becoming repositories of maritime resistance. Inside these halls, the stories of the sovereign were told to the rhythm of the modern world. You hear the rhythmic clack-clack of mahjong tiles in the temple courtyard, a sound that connects the gambling house of her retirement to the spiritual sanctuary of her legacy. The air is cool and smells of aged oolong and the metallic scent of the nearby shipyards. The sovereign's statue is now surrounded by modern offerings, small plastic ships, digital watches, and paper money. This rhythmic continuity shows that her spirit is not a relic, but a living, breathing part of the Delta's soul. She is the sovereign of the present, her code still providing a sense of identity to a people whose world is constantly changing. As you lie in your bed, listening to the rhythmic, distant sounds of the modern harbor, you can imagine the red flag still circling the perimeter. The sound is the rhythmic, deep groan of the harbor pilings and the soft, steady murmur of the wind in the wires. The smell is the global salt, the scent of a sea that connects all shores. The sovereign is not a vengeful ghost, but a rhythmic presence that ensures the balance of the water. You are safe in the cradle of the legend, protected by the silence of the temples and the eternal rhythm of the Ghost Fleet. The water is deep, the sovereign is eternal, and the red flag is the heartbeat of the sea. To truly inhabit this spiritual landscape, one must imagine the nocturnal pilgrimage to the Lantau shrines. These are paths carved into the side of the cliffs, where the sound is the rhythmic, heavy crash of the Pacific breakers against the rocks below. The air is wet with sea spray and smells of crushed shells and cold foam. You walk the path by the light of a paper lantern, your footsteps a rhythmic tap-tap on the wet stone. As you reach the shrine, the sound of the ocean is filtered through the stone arches, becoming a deep, rhythmic breathing. This is the voice of the sovereign. The pilgrims believe that if they listen closely to the rhythm of the waves, they can hear the sixth watch, the watch of the spirits. Inside the shrine, the sensory offering is a ritual of the three elements. First, the element of smoke, the burning of the joss sticks, creating a rhythmic, swirling pattern in the air. Second, the element of water, the pouring of rice wine into 3 small cups, the sound a rhythmic, musical glug-glug. Third, the element of sound, the striking of a small bronze bell, its resonance a long, rhythmic shimmer that fades into the sound of the sea. This ritual is a way of synchronizing the heart with the rhythm of the sovereign. The smell is a thick, heady mixture of wine, smoke, and salt scent that triggers a state of deep, rhythmic relaxation. The ghost fleet also manifests in the natural geometry of the delta. The fishermen believe that the way the clouds gather over the 3 paps of the Ladrin Islands is a signal from the sovereign. You see the rhythmic, slow gathering of the gray-bottomed cumulus, looking like a fleet of junks at anchor. The sound is the rhythmic, low-frequency rumble of the dry thunder that often precedes a summer storm. The smell is the scent of incoming rain, a dusty, ozonic aroma that clears the head. To the people of the water, this is the sovereign raising the flag. It is a rhythmic reminder that the sea is a place of power and that they must always respect the code. As the 21st century brings towering skyscrapers and neon lights to the shores of the Pearl River, the sleep factor of the sovereign's ghost becomes even more essential. In the concrete canyons of Hong Kong and Macau, the sound of the city is a chaotic, non-rhythmic roar. But if you go down to the Star Ferry piers, at midnight, the sea rhythm returns. You hear the rhythmic, heavy creak of the wooden fenders and the soft, steady lapping of the water. The smell of the harbor, the salt, the diesel, and the ancient silts, the same smell that Zheng Yi Sao knew. In this moment, the ghost fleet is not a myth. It is the foundation of the water. The sovereign is the one who keeps the city from drifting away. The sovereign has finally achieved the universal rhythm. She is no longer just a woman of history. She is the frequency of the coast. You hear her in the rhythmic ping of the sonar, the rhythmic thump of the freighter's heart, and the rhythmic sigh of the beach at night. The journey of the Red Flag sovereign is complete, but the rhythm of the Queen is just beginning. To look upon the South China Sea at the end of this long liquid journey is to see more than just a body of water. It is to see the canvas of a life that was painted in the most vibrant reds and the deepest blacks. We have traveled from the silt-heavy tributaries of the Pearl River to the thunderous blockades of the Tiger's Gate, and finally into the quiet, mahjong-scented shadows of a Canton retirement. Now, as the final watch begins, we must reconcile the 2 ends of the sovereign's life. You must imagine the sensory fusion of the flowerboat and the flagship. The air of the delta at midnight carries the sweetness of the jasmine from the brothels and the sharp, sulphurous bite of the pirate's black powder. They are not opposites. They are the rhythmic inhalation and exhalation of the same extraordinary existence. The sleep factor of this final resolution is a state of absolute buoyancy. You are no longer standing on the deck or the shore. You are floating in the center of the transition. The soundscape is a perfect, rhythmic equilibrium. You hear the soft, melodic tinkle of the glass chimes on a flowerboat, and simultaneously the deep, resonant groan of a junk's cedar hull. These sounds do not clash. They weave together into a single, hypnotic tapestry of sound. The smell is a complex, beautiful aroma, the scent of the sovereign's peace, a mixture of expensive silk, salt spray, old wood, and fresh river rain. It is the scent of a woman who rose from the very bottom of the social tide to command the horizon itself. Zheng Yi Sao's life was a masterclass in the geometry of survival. She understood that to survive the storm, one must become the center of the storm. As you prepare for sleep, consider the rhythm of the center. You hear the rhythmic, slow thud-thud of your own heartbeat, which mirrors the rhythmic, slow thud-thud of the night watchman's clapper on the flagship. There is a profound safety in this synchronization. The sovereign's code was not just for the pirates, it was for the heart. It was a reminder that order, discipline, and clarity are the anchors that keep us from being swept away by the chaos of the world. The sound of her legacy is the rhythmic, steady sigh of the Oshuna sound that says, all is accounted for, all is in its place. The sensory immersion of the eternal tide is a study in the color red. In her youth, it was the red of the flowerboat lanterns. In her power, it was the red of the flagship's sails. In her wedding, it was the red of her silk gown. Now, in the final light of history, it is the red of the setting sun over the Ladrone Islands. You see the water turning a deep, rhythmic crimson, reflecting the sky. The sound is the rhythmic, gentle shush-shush of the waves as they wash over the sandbars, a sound that is both a beginning and an ending. The smell of the evening is the scent of the great return, the smell of the sea reclaiming the land, a fresh, cold, and infinite aroma that clears the mind of all remaining tension. Inside the grand cabin of your mind, the sovereign invites you to put down the abacus. The ledgers are closed, the silver has been counted, the men have been paid, and the peace has been negotiated. You hear the rhythmic creak of the cabin's timbers, a sound that feels like a protective embrace. The air is cool and still, smelling of sovereign's rest, a scent of aged cedar and clean linen. You are no longer the navigator, you are the passenger. The sovereign is at the helm, her eyes fixed on the North Star, her hand steady on the tiller. The boat is moving through the ghost water toward the shore of dreams, and the rhythm of the movement is the only thing that matters. The red flag was never about war. It was about the freedom to be silent. Zheng Yi Sao fought 80,000 battles so that she could eventually sit in a garden and listen to the water. You are now entering that garden. You hear the rhythmic, soft plink of the bamboo waterspout and the rhythmic, low-frequency murmur of the river. The world of the cannons is 1,000,000 miles away, a faint, rhythmic echo that only serves to make the present silence deeper. The smell is the scent of midnight jasmine, a sweet, heavy fragrance that pulls you down into the velvet dark. Imagine the great red flag of the flagship being lowered for the last time. As it touches the water, the red ink dissolves, spreading into the sea like a cloud of wine. The sound is a rhythmic, silent furl. The water absorbs the color, the history, and the power. The sea is now the flag. Every wave that hits the shore is a piece of her story. Every rhythmic slap of the tide is a syllable of her code. You are sleeping in her element now. The air is the air of the sovereign. The water is the water of the queen. The soundscape is the rhythmic, eternal breathing of the South China Sea, a sound that has no beginning and no end. As you drift into the deepest, most restorative sleep of the journey, the image of Zheng Yi Sao remains as a beacon of the deep. She is standing on the horizon, a figure of light and shadow, her red cloak merging with the dawn. The sound is the rhythmic, beautiful silence of the morning mist. The smell is the scent of the new shore, a fresh, green, and hopeful aroma. You have traveled through the life of the most successful pirate in history, and you have found that her greatest treasure was not gold, but the peace of a conquered mind. The water is deep, the sovereign is at rest, and the red flag is the sky. You are safe in the eternal tide, protected by the rhythm of the sovereign and the silence of the sea. This final peace is a homecoming of the spirit. You must imagine the very last sound of the story, the sound of a single small pearl being dropped into the deep, still water of a mountain lake. The sound is a rhythmic, crystalline plink, followed by a series of perfect, expanding circles. These circles are the rhythms of the sovereign. They reach out to the edges of the world, touching every shore, every boat, and every heart. The smell is the scent of pure water, a scent that has no scent, yet contains everything. It is the scent of the void that Zheng Yi Sao mastered in her final years. You hear the rhythmic, soft rustle of the silk curtains in your room, a sound that mimics the rustle of the bamboo sails in the light breeze. The sleep factor is now absolute. The weight of your body is the weight of a junk at anchor, steady and immovable. The rhythm of your breath is the rhythm of the monsoon's low, powerful and life-giving. You are part of the great Pearl River Delta of dreams, where all the rivers of your life flow together into the vast, quiet ocean of the sovereign's memory. The sound is the rhythmic, distant toll of a bell, signaling that the final watch is over. The sovereign has given the order, rest. The sensory immersion concludes with the absolute unity of the senses. You can taste the salt on your lips. You can smell the jasmine in the air. You can hear the creak of the wood, and you can feel the coolness of the silk. They are all one thing. The peace of Zheng Yi Sao, the woman of the flower boat, the commander of the 80,000, and the lady of the gambling house are all gathered here in the quiet of your sleep. They are whispering the final code. The sea is your bed, the wind is your blanket, and the stars are your guide. The sound is the rhythmic, gentle sigh of the world as it turns toward the night. The sovereign is the dragon, and the peace is the pearl. They are held together in the rhythmic movement of the tide. The water is deep, the moon is a silver guardian, and the queen of pirates has finally led you home. You are safe. You are at rest. The red flag is folded, the abacus is still, and the sovereign is the sea. Farewell to the world of the delta. Welcome to the world of the deep. The journey is complete, and the rhythm is eternal.